Close your eyes, take a slow breath in, hold it for a moment, and let it go. Tonight, we are going to tell a story about trust, about what happens when smart people decide they are the exception to every rule, about a man who built one of the largest financial empires in the history of cryptocurrency and then watched it dissolve in 72 hours like salt in warm water. In November 2022, $32 billion vanished, not stolen by hackers working in the dark, not lost in a market crash that no one could have predicted, not swallowed by some system error in the middle of the night, handed away, deliberately, by a man who had spent years, on every stage, in every interview, in every carefully crafted public appearance, convincing the world that he was trying to save it. His name was Sam Bankman-Fried, and for a brief, strange, luminous moment in history, he was the most trusted man in crypto. He donated hundreds of millions of dollars to charity. He testified before the United States Congress, calmly explaining the future of finance to people twice his age. He was photographed with presidents and prime ministers and celebrities. He was called the next Warren Buffett. He was 29 years old, wore cargo shorts to every meeting, slept on a beanbag in his office, and told anyone who would listen that he did not care about money. He was lying. Tonight, we are going to follow the rise and fall of Sam Bankman-Fried from the beginning. We are going to walk through the philosophy that justified everything he did. We are going to meet the small, strange, brilliant cast of people who built an empire in the Bahamas and then burned it to the ground. We are going to sit with the wreckage of over 1 million people who trusted them. And we're going to ask a question that has no comfortable answer. How did so many smart people trust him for so long? Get comfortable. Let your body settle into wherever you are resting. This story moves slowly at first, because the best frauds always do. Sam Bankman-Fried was born in 1992, the first child of 2 Stanford law professors. His father, Joseph Bankman, was a tax law scholar. His mother, Barbara Fried, was a philosopher who had written extensively about moral responsibility and political theory. They were, by almost any measure, a family that took ideas seriously, ideas about how the world worked, about what people owed each other, about the relationship between intelligence and obligation. Sam grew up in a house where thinking carefully was not a hobby. It was a way of life. He was, by the accounts of people who knew him in childhood, an unusual child, intensely logical, somewhat detached from the normal rhythms of social interaction. He was not exactly cold. People who knew him well described him as capable of warmth, of loyalty, of genuine affection. But he processed the world through a kind of relentless calculation that set him apart from other children. He attended school in the Bay Area. He was good at math, good at games, good at any activity that rewarded pattern recognition and strategic thinking. He went to MIT and studied physics, which is the discipline that tends to attract people who want to understand why things are the way they are at the deepest possible level. And then, somewhere in his time at MIT, he encountered a philosophy that would shape everything that followed. It was called effective altruism. Effective altruism, or EA as its followers call it, is at its core a deceptively simple idea. If you care about doing good in the world, you should try to do the most good possible. Not just some good. You should think carefully, mathematically even, about where your time and money can have the largest positive impact per unit of effort. You should not give money to the charity that makes you feel best. You should give it to the charity that saves the most lives per dollar. You should not follow the career path that sounds most meaningful. You should follow the path that allows you to do the most measurable good. You should not trust your instincts or your feelings. You should trust the math. It is a compelling framework. It attracts brilliant, earnest people. Many of them have done genuinely important things because of it. Funded malaria nets that saved hundreds of thousands of lives, supported research into catastrophic risks, moved resources to places that desperately needed them. But it is also, in the hands of the wrong person, an extremely dangerous framework, because it provides a mathematical justification for anything. If you believe that your actions will lead to enormous good in the long run, you can rationalize almost any behavior in the short run. Every small transgression becomes acceptable collateral damage. Every compromise becomes a necessary tactical step. Every lie becomes defensible if the intended destination is good enough. EA, in other words, is a philosophy that requires its practitioners to be honest about their own motivations. It requires them to be vigilant against self-deception. It requires them to maintain constantly a distinction between what is actually good and what merely feels good or serves their interests. Sam Bankman-Fried was not that kind of person. He discovered EA in college, and it hit him like a religious conversion. He was introduced to it through a series of lectures and discussions at MIT. He met people in the EA community who were thoughtful, idealistic, genuinely committed to making the world better. He read the philosophical literature, he thought through the arguments, and he became convinced that the most effective way to do good was not to become a doctor or a teacher or a researcher or a policymaker. The most effective thing he could do, given his skills, his intelligence, his tolerance for risk, was to earn as much money as possible, as fast as possible, and then give it away. This idea has a name in EA circles. It is called earn to give, and Sam was very, very good at earning. After graduating from MIT in 2014, he joined a trading firm called Jane Street Capital. Jane Street is one of the most selective and sophisticated quantitative trading operations in the world. It trades in equities, bonds, ETFs, options, a vast range of financial instruments, using algorithms and human expertise simultaneously. Getting a job at Jane Street for a young person with a quantitative background is something like getting a first-round pick in a very exclusive draft. Sam thrived there. He learned quantitative trading, the art of finding tiny price differences across markets and exploiting them at enormous speed. He was good at it. He was, by the accounts of people who worked alongside him, exceptionally good at it. He also absorbed something that would prove far more consequential than any trading strategy. He absorbed a way of thinking about risk, about probability, about expected value. The idea that a small chance of a very large outcome could be worth more than a high chance of a modest outcome. The idea that rational actors should be willing to take bets that feel uncomfortable if the math supports them. At Jane Street, this was just a framework for trading. In Sam's hands, over the following decade, it would become a framework for something else entirely. He also learned at Jane Street that markets could be irrational, that prices could be wrong, that if you were faster and smarter than everyone else and willing to tolerate more discomfort and uncertainty, you could profit from other people's mistakes. He spent 3 years at Jane Street. He was good at his job. He made money. He donated a significant portion of his income to effective altruism-aligned charities. He was living the philosophy. And then he noticed something extraordinary. In 2017, the cryptocurrency markets were in the grip of a peculiar and short-lived frenzy. Bitcoin was rising. Ethereum was rising. New coins were appearing every week, each with its own white paper and its own promise of technological revolution. The atmosphere was something between a gold rush and a carnival. And in the middle of all of it, Sam noticed a pricing anomaly that was, by the standards of any serious financial market, almost absurdly large. Bitcoin was trading at a different price in Japan than it was in the United States. Not by a fraction of a percent, the kind of tiny difference that high-frequency traders in traditional markets would fight over, by as much as 10%. The reason for this was a combination of factors. Japanese retail investors had developed a particular enthusiasm for Bitcoin. Demand was high. The Japanese yen was not easy to move across borders quickly, and the cryptocurrency markets of 2017 were fragmented and immature, without the efficient arbitrage mechanisms that would eventually close such gaps. For anyone who could move quickly enough, buying Bitcoin in the United States and selling it in Japan over and over, this difference represented an almost implausible opportunity. Sam moved quickly. In late 2017, he left Jane Street. He recruited a small team. He started a trading operation that would exploit this and similar inefficiencies across the cryptocurrency markets. He called it Alameda Research. The name was deliberately bland, deliberately obscure, named, he later explained, after Alameda County in California, near where he had grown up, precisely because it said nothing about what the company actually did. He did not want attention. Not yet. He wanted to make money. The Japan arbitrage was even more complicated to execute than it sounds. You needed accounts on Japanese exchanges, which required navigating a different regulatory framework. You needed to convert dollars to yen, buy Bitcoin, sell Bitcoin for yen, and convert yen back to dollars, and do all of this before the price difference closed. Sam and his small team worked around the clock. They built systems. They automated what could be automated. They solved one problem, and then another, and then another. By early 2018, the Japanese premium had largely disappeared as other traders caught on. But Alameda had already made substantial profits, and Sam had learned something even more important than how to execute an arbitrage trade. He had learned that the cryptocurrency markets were, in their early form, full of inefficiencies that no one else was exploiting, full of gaps that careful, fast, mathematically rigorous trading could turn into money. Alameda grew. By 2019, it was generating millions of dollars per month. It employed a dozen people, then more. It traded not just Bitcoin, but a wide range of cryptocurrency assets across dozens of exchanges in multiple countries. And Sam was already thinking bigger. He had an idea, not just for a trading firm that operated in the shadows, quietly extracting value from inefficient markets. He wanted something more visible, more powerful, a platform where the entire market came to him. He wanted to build an exchange. FTX launched in May 2019. The name stood for Futures Exchange. It was, from the beginning, aimed at a more sophisticated audience than most cryptocurrency exchanges of the time. While platforms like Coinbase were focused on making it easy for retail investors to buy and hold Bitcoin, FTX was designed for traders. People who wanted to trade perpetual futures, options, leveraged tokens, and other complex instruments that the mainstream platforms did not offer. Sam had built it in part because he had spent 2 years trading on other exchanges and found them inadequate. Too slow, too limited, too prone to errors at critical moments. He believed he could do better, and he had the engineering talent, through his co-founder Gary Wang, to try. Gary Wang was, in many ways, Sam's opposite. Where Sam was loud and visible and constantly performing, Gary was quiet, methodical, almost invisible. He had been friends with Sam since they attended a math camp together as teenagers. He had also gone to MIT, where he had studied computer science. He had worked at Google before joining Sam at Alameda. Gary was the technical brain behind FTX. He built the exchange's infrastructure, managed its engineering team, and kept the systems running. He understood, better than almost anyone, exactly how the platform worked at every level. He also understood, better than almost anyone, exactly what was wrong with it. But we will come to that. For now, let us stay with the early days of FTX. Because in 2019 and 2020, before any of the rot had become visible, FTX was a genuinely impressive operation. The platform worked. It was fast and reliable. The products it offered were sophisticated. The customer service was, by the standards of the industry, unusually responsive. Traders noticed. Professionals who had been frustrated with the limitations of other platforms migrated to FTX. Volume grew. revenue grew. By 2021, FTX was one of the largest cryptocurrency exchanges in the world. It was processing billions of dollars in trades every day. It had expanded from futures to spot trading, from crypto to stock trading in certain markets. Sam had raised hundreds of millions of dollars from some of the most prestigious venture capital firms in the world: Sequoia Capital, SoftBank, Temasek, BlackRock. The company was valued at $18 billion. Sam Bankman-Fried was estimated to be worth $26 billion on paper. He was 29 years old. The headquarters were in the Bahamas. Sam had moved the operation there in 2021, partly for regulatory reasons. The Bahamas had a more accommodating legal framework for cryptocurrency businesses, and partly, it seemed, because he genuinely liked it. The climate was good, the setting was beautiful, and it was far, very far from the scrutiny that would eventually come. The office was in a luxury resort complex called the Albany. It was, by any normal standard, a spectacular location. The Albany was designed for wealthy tourists and long-term residents. It had a yacht marina, restaurants, a spa, the kind of facilities that suggested money without making a point of it. But the office itself did not look like a $26 billion operation. It was a penthouse, high up in one of the buildings. The furniture was functional at best. There were gaming setups and screens everywhere. People slept on the floor sometimes, or on couches. Sam famously kept a beanbag chair in his working area, not as an affectation, he insisted, but because he genuinely found it comfortable. There were bags of chips on the desks and empty water bottles on the floors, and the general atmosphere of a startup that had grown very fast and not paused to furnish itself properly. The people who worked there were young. Many of them were in their mid to late 20s. Many had come from elite universities: MIT, Harvard, Stanford, Oxford. Many had come through effective altruism channels, recruited because they shared Sam's philosophical commitments, or at least appeared to. The hours were extraordinary. People worked 15, 16, 17 hours a day. They worked on weekends. They worked from the office, from their apartments, from wherever they happened to be. The culture was one of constant availability, constant intensity, constant movement. Sam was at the center of it all. He was in the office constantly. He was on calls constantly. And he played video games during meetings, a habit that struck outsiders as bizarre and disrespectful, but that Sam defended earnestly, claiming it helped him think, that the physical activity of playing kept his mind engaged rather than wandering. The inner circle was small, and it was tight, and it was intertwined in ways that went beyond the professional. There was Gary Wang, the co-founder and chief technology officer, quiet, essential, deeply trusted. There was Nishad Singh, the head of engineering, another MIT graduate, another effective altruist, another person who had joined because he believed in the mission and trusted Sam. There was Ryan Salami, who ran the Bahamas operations, and who would eventually become one of the first members of the inner circle to cooperate with prosecutors. And there was Caroline Ellison. Caroline was, by any measure, one of the more complicated figures in the FTX story. She had grown up in Massachusetts, the daughter of two MIT economics professors, a background that, in its intellectual intensity, had something in common with Sam's. She had gone to Stanford, where she had studied mathematics. She had worked at Jane Street, where she and Sam had first met, and she had joined Alameda Research in its early days, eventually rising to become its co-CEO, and then, when the other co-CEO departed, its sole CEO. She was 27 when the collapse came. She was running a multi-billion-dollar trading firm. She was also, at various points in the preceding years, Sam's girlfriend. The relationship was complicated in ways that are difficult to summarize. They had dated, then stopped, then circled each other in the strange, compressed social world of the Albany penthouse. Sam was polyamorous, or claimed to be, in the detached, philosophical manner he brought to everything. Caroline wrote about her inner life on a public blog with a candor that sometimes startled readers. She discussed her anxieties, her ambitions, her doubts about herself and about EA, and about the choices she had made. She was not, in the view of many who knew the industry, the obvious choice to run a trading operation of Alameda's scale and complexity. She knew it. She had written about it herself, with the honesty that sometimes characterized her public writing. The choice to make her CEO of Alameda was Sam's. Whatever his reasons, and various people have offered various theories, the decision meant that the person running the trading firm most deeply entangled with FTX's customer funds was someone who was professionally dependent on Sam's approval, personally entangled with him, and temperamentally inclined toward loyalty over confrontation. From the outside, in 2021 and into 2022, all of this was invisible. From the outside, FTX looked like the future of finance. Sam Bankman-Fried looked like a visionary. His philanthropic commitments were substantial and real. He had actually given hundreds of millions of dollars to effective altruism-aligned causes, to pandemic preparedness research, to political campaigns. He had positioned himself as a responsible actor in an industry known for its irresponsibility. He was the person who showed up in Washington and testified sensibly about cryptocurrency regulation. He was the person who called for more oversight, more transparency, more accountability. He was the person the regulators called when they wanted to understand the industry. And deep inside that empire, something was already rotting. Here's what was actually happening. To understand the fraud at the heart of FTX, you need to understand a few things about how cryptocurrency exchanges work. When you deposit money on an exchange, dollars, Bitcoin, Ethereum, anything, you are trusting that exchange to hold it safely, to keep it separate from the company's own money, to have it available when you want to withdraw it. This is not a complex principle. It is the same principle that governs every other financial institution that holds customer funds. Your bank holds your money separately from its own operating capital. Your brokerage holds your stock separately from its own assets. This is not just a convention. In most jurisdictions, it is the law. FTX did not do this. FTX had created its own cryptocurrency token in 2019. It was called FTT. Like most exchange tokens of its kind, FTT gave holders certain benefits on the platform: reduced trading voting rights in certain decisions, access to various promotional programs. FTX promoted FTT heavily and held a large reserve of it. Here's the first thing you need to understand about FTT. Its value was, in a fundamental sense, circular. FTT was valuable because FTX was valuable. If FTX was successful, generating revenue, growing its user base, maintaining its position as a top-tier exchange, then FTT was worth something. If FTX ever stumbled, FTT would fall too. FTX used FTT as collateral on its balance sheet. It listed its reserves of FTT as assets. This made the balance sheet look healthy, even as the actual cash and crypto holdings became dangerously inadequate. It was, as someone would later put it, a tower built on its own reflection. And FTX was lending enormous amounts of customer money to Alameda Research. Not borrowing, not investing, transferring. Customer deposits, funds that belonged to individual users that those users believed were sitting safely in their accounts, were being moved to Alameda, the trading firm that Sam also controlled. What was Alameda doing with this money? Trading, primarily. Alameda was in the business of trading cryptocurrency markets, and trading requires capital. In the early years, Alameda had been profitable enough to fund itself. But as it grew, as it tried to make larger bets, participate in more markets, take on more risk, it needed more capital than it was generating. The solution, in Sam's framing of things, was to use FTX's customer deposits as a source of liquidity. Alameda would borrow from FTX. Alameda would make trades. Alameda would eventually pay it back, except that Alameda kept losing money. The cryptocurrency markets of 2021 and 2022 were treacherous. They had risen to extraordinary heights during the pandemic-era liquidity boom, when central banks around the world were flooding the system with money, and retail investors were pouring into every speculative asset available. And then, as central banks began to raise interest rates and the liquidity began to drain away, cryptocurrency prices collapsed. Bitcoin fell from nearly $70,000 in November 2021 to under $20,000 by the summer of 2022. Ethereum fell by similar proportions. Many smaller coins simply ceased to have meaningful value. Alameda, which had been making leveraged bets on these markets, was caught badly. The positions it had built up during the bull market were now enormous losses, and the losses were being covered in part by money that did not belong to Alameda. There was a moment in the spring of 2022 when a cryptocurrency called Terra and its related stablecoin collapsed that may have been the point of no return. Terra was a system built around a so-called algorithmic stablecoin called UST, which was supposed to maintain a $1 value through a complicated mechanism involving another token called Luna. When confidence in the system began to erode in May 2022, the mechanism failed catastrophically. UST lost its peg. Luna became worthless. Tens of billions of dollars in value were destroyed in a matter of days. Alameda had significant exposure to this ecosystem. The losses were severe. By the summer of 2022, there was a gap, a growing, dangerous gap, between what FTX owed its customers and what was actually there. The funds that customers believed were in their accounts did not, in significant measure, exist. They had been used, lost, spent, or otherwise consumed. Who knew about this? The inner circle knew. Caroline knew. She had been the one, at various points, directing the transfers and managing the intertwined finances. She had built spreadsheets, multiple versions of spreadsheets, that tracked the true state of things, and separate versions that could be shown to outside parties without revealing the truth. Gary Wang knew. He had built the systems that allowed the transfers to happen. There was a line of code in FTX's software, a special exception that allowed Alameda to withdraw customer funds without triggering the normal limits that Gary had written at Sam's direction. Nishad Singh knew. He had come to understand what was happening and had confronted Sam about it. Sam had reassured him. Nishad had stayed, and Sam knew. The question that would consume courtrooms and journalists and commentators for the following 2 years was exactly how much Sam knew, exactly when he knew it, and exactly how deliberately he had constructed this arrangement. Sam's position, articulated in dozens of interviews and podcasts and Twitter exchanges and eventually, at considerable length in a federal courtroom, was that he had not fully understood the scale of the problem, that things had gotten out of hand in ways he had not properly tracked, that the accounting was confused, that Alameda and FTX had always operated with more intermingling than was ideal, and that he had failed to notice how bad it had gotten, that he had made mistakes, that he was sorry. The jury did not believe him. But we are getting ahead of ourselves, because in the autumn of 2022, none of this was public. The customers of FTX did not know. The institutional investors, the venture funds and hedge funds and sovereign wealth funds that had valued the company at billions of dollars, did not know. The politicians who had taken his donations and posed for photographs and invited him to speak at their conferences did not know. The world saw a 29-year-old billionaire in cargo shorts, giving away money, building the future, sleeping on a beanbag chair. They did not see what was underneath. On November 2nd, 2022, a journalist at a publication called CoinDesk published a story. It was not, on the surface, a devastating story. It was based on a leaked document, a balance sheet for Alameda Research that someone, for reasons that remain somewhat murky, had provided to the journalist. The story did not accuse anyone of fraud. It did not make dramatic allegations. It simply reported what the balance sheet showed. And what it showed was troubling to anyone who knew how to read it. Alameda's balance sheet listed FTT tokens, the exchange token that FTX itself had created, as its single largest asset, billions of dollars worth of FTT, sitting there as the primary basis for Alameda's claimed financial health. The story spread through the cryptocurrency industry with quiet alarm. Analysts and traders began asking the obvious questions. If Alameda's balance sheet was this tightly tied to FTT, what happened when FTT's price fell? What happened to FTX's own balance sheet, which was presumably also loaded with FTT? If FTX ever had a liquidity problem and tried to sell FTT to raise cash, would that selling itself cause FTT's price to fall further in a self-reinforcing spiral? The questions were uncomfortable. No one had definitive answers, but the air had changed. Sam responded on Twitter, as he always did, with a combination of dismissiveness and reassurance. He posted a thread explaining that FTT was just an asset on Alameda's books like any other. He said that everything was fine, that the story was overblown. He ended with the words, "A competitor is trying to go after us," a hint, though not a direct accusation, toward what was coming. Because there was a competitor, and it was watching. For several days after the CoinDesk story, the situation was tense but not yet catastrophic. FTX was still operating. Withdrawals were still processing. The price of FTT had fallen but had not collapsed. There was anxiety in the markets, a kind of collective holding of breath. Then, on the morning of November 6th, 2022, a message appeared on Twitter. It came from Changpeng Zhao. Changpeng Zhao was known universally in the cryptocurrency world by a single nickname, CZ. He was the founder and CEO of Binance, the largest cryptocurrency exchange in the world by trading volume and the most direct competitor to FTX. The relationship between CZ and Sam had always been complicated. Binance had been an early investor in FTX back in 2019. Several years later, as FTX grew into a genuine rival and Sam began positioning himself as the responsible face of crypto regulation, Binance had sold its stake. As part of that transaction, Binance had received a large amount of FTT tokens, approximately $500 million worth at the peak valuation. CZ had held those tokens for years, quietly saying nothing, until that morning. The tweet was, in a technical sense, brief. 11 words long. CZ wrote that, due to recent revelations, Binance would be liquidating its FTT holdings. 11 words. The market understood immediately. If Binance began selling hundreds of millions of dollars worth of FTT into the open market, the price of FTT would fall. If the price of FT fell, Alameda's balance sheet, which was built on FTT, would deteriorate badly. If Alameda's balance sheet deteriorated, its ability to cover its debts to FTX would be called into question. If Alameda could not cover its debts to FTX, FTX might not have enough to cover its obligations to customers. If FTX did not have enough to cover its obligations to customers, anyone who had money on the platform should take it out. Now. Immediately. Before it was too late. This reasoning, which took experienced market observers perhaps 10 minutes to work through, took less time than that to propagate through the industry. The bank run began. Within hours, customers were trying to withdraw their funds. By the end of November 6th, FTX had received over $6 billion in withdrawal requests. This was, by a significant margin, the largest single day of outflows the exchange had ever experienced. It was more than the platform had processed in any previous week. Behind the scenes, Sam reached out to Caroline. He needed to understand precisely how bad things were. Caroline ran the numbers. The numbers were very bad. Sam began making calls. He called investors. He called potential partners. He reached out to rival exchanges and venture funds, and anyone who might have the resources and the willingness to inject capital into FTX before it became public that FTX was insolvent. Most of these calls ended quickly. No one was interested in pouring money into a crisis they did not understand. But Sam also called CZ directly, and CZ, remarkably, said he would look at it. What happened over the following 3 days is one of the most compressed and complete financial disasters in modern history. On the morning of November 7th, 2022, Binance and FTX announced that they had signed a non-binding letter of intent. Binance was considering acquiring FTX. If the deal went through, Binance would effectively absorb its rival, assume its liabilities, and, at least in theory, protect FTX's customers from the full consequences of what had happened. For approximately 12 hours, people in the cryptocurrency industry allowed themselves to hope that a rescue was coming, that the damage would be contained, that the customers would be made whole. It was the last moment of ambiguity in the story. Binance sent a due diligence team to examine FTX's finances. What they found over the following hours was described in Binance's public statement as mishandled customer funds and alleged U.S. agency investigations. The detail of what the due diligence team actually found has never been fully disclosed, but the conclusion was immediate and absolute. On the afternoon of November 8th, Binance announced that it was withdrawing from the proposed acquisition. "The issues are beyond our control or ability to help," the statement said. The door had opened for one moment, and then it closed. What followed was a cascade. Withdrawal requests continued to pour in. By November 8th, FTX was completely unable to process them. A message appeared on the platform stating that withdrawals were temporarily paused. This message on a cryptocurrency exchange is the equivalent of a bank putting a sign on its door saying the vault is empty. It is the visible manifestation of insolvency. Customers who were watching their dashboards saw their account balances change to zero, or to error messages, or to numbers that were clearly wrong. On social media, the responses ranged from disbelief to fury to something that read like grief. People posted screenshots of accounts that represented years of savings. They posted messages about house deposits and retirement funds and money set aside for their children. They did not yet know the full story, but they knew what it felt like to watch something disappear. Inside FTX, the final hours were chaotic in ways that would later seem almost unbelievable. Internal communications that were later disclosed in legal proceedings showed a leadership team that had shifted, very suddenly, from crisis management to something closer to shock. People who had believed on some level that they would find a way out, that Sam would find a buyer, or raise money, or work something out, were confronting the reality that there was no way out. Sam sent messages to Caroline. He said he was sorry. "I'm sorry for putting you in this position," he wrote. On the evening of November 8th, an extraordinary thing happened. Someone, it has never been definitively determined who, initiated a large transfer of cryptocurrency out of FTX wallets. Hundreds of millions of dollars worth of various tokens were moved to external addresses. Within hours, the blockchain analytics firms that monitor large cryptocurrency movements were publishing alerts. FTX's wallets were being drained. FTX's chief executive officer tweeted that the platform had been hacked. John Ray, the restructuring specialist who would shortly take over the company, would later describe what happened that night as unauthorized transfers. A careful phrase that left the question of who authorized them, and whether any of it was a deliberate attempt to move assets beyond the reach of creditors, to the federal prosecutors who were already beginning to investigate. On November 9th, 2022, FTX filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy protection in the United States. The filing listed liabilities of somewhere between $10 and $50 billion. The uncertainty in that range was itself a statement about the state of FTX's record keeping. The number of creditors was estimated at over 1 million people in more than 100 countries. Sam Bankman-Fried resigned as CEO. He was replaced by John Ray. John Ray had been through financial disasters before. He was the restructuring specialist who had overseen the liquidation of Enron, the energy trading company that had collapsed in 2001 in what was then considered the largest corporate fraud in American history. What he found at FTX was, in his own assessment, worse. In his initial filing with the bankruptcy court, Ray wrote words that became among the most quoted in the entire saga. He had overseen, he wrote, many financial failures across many decades. He had never seen anything like this. There were no reliable accounting records. There was no separation between customer funds and company funds. There was no meaningful board of directors exercising oversight over management. There were no proper internal controls of any kind. He described what he found as an utter lack of trustworthy financial information. The money was gone. Some of it had been lost in Alameda's bad trades, bets placed in the cryptocurrency markets of 2021 and 2022 that had gone wrong in ways that consumed billions of dollars. Some had been spent on luxury real estate in the Bahamas, where FTX and its affiliated entities had purchased properties worth over $300 million. Some had gone to political donations. Sam had been one of the largest individual political donors in the 2022 American election cycle, giving over $100 million to candidates and causes, primarily on the Democratic side of the aisle. Some had gone to venture capital investments, to celebrity endorsement deals, to sports sponsorships, to a bewildering variety of expenditures that had been made with customer funds as though they were the company's own, and some was simply unaccounted for. The trail disappeared into a labyrinth of shell companies, offshore accounts, and transactions that had been deliberately obscured. The customers who had trusted FTX with their savings, their investment accounts, their retirement funds, their children's college money, they waited. Some of them would eventually receive portions of their money back through the long, grinding bankruptcy process that would take years. But in November 2022, with the exchange shuttered and the CEO in custody and the money gone, they had nothing. They waited. Sam Bankman-Fried did not immediately disappear. This was, in retrospect, one of the stranger and more revealing aspects of the entire affair. In the days after FTX's collapse, as the financial world convulsed and his former colleagues began cooperating with federal prosecutors and the bankruptcy lawyers descended on the Albany penthouse, Sam remained in the Bahamas. He was still in the building, he was still tweeting, he was still, remarkably, giving interviews to journalists, to podcasters, to YouTube creators, to anyone who would speak with him. He apologized, frequently. He apologized for mistakes, for failures of oversight, for not being more careful, for not paying more attention to things he should have understood. He continued to maintain, in every venue and to every interviewer, that he had not intended to defraud anyone, that things had gotten out of hand, that the accounting had been confused, that he regretted what had happened and was sorry for the people who had been hurt. He was, in the assessment of almost everyone who watched these performances, either deeply delusional or extraordinarily cynical, perhaps some combination of the two. He continued to post on Twitter. He engaged with critics. He participated in public debates about what had happened and why. He gave a long interview on a podcast in which he discussed, at considerable length, his philosophy of risk and his views on the events that had led to FTX's collapse. He seemed, to some observers, like a man who genuinely did not believe he had done anything criminal. Or, alternatively, like a man who was trying to shape the narrative before prosecutors could shape it for him. On December 12, 2022, exactly 1 month after the collapse of FTX, Sam Bankman-Fried was arrested at his apartment in Nassau. The arrest was made by Bahamian authorities at the request of the United States Department of Justice. The indictment listed 8 criminal charges: wire fraud, securities fraud, commodities fraud, money laundering, and conspiracy to commit each of these offenses. Sam's lawyers indicated that he would contest extradition. He did not contest it for long. On December 21st, he waived his extradition rights and was transferred to the custody of American federal marshals. He was flown to New York and appeared before a federal judge who set bail at $250 million, the largest in the Southern District of New York's history. The bail conditions were unusual. Sam was released to the custody of his parents, whose home in Stanford, California, became, for the better part of the following year, his residence. He was fitted with an ankle monitor. He was restricted from accessing the internet except for limited purposes. He was prohibited from transferring assets or accessing cryptocurrency. He spent the months between his arrest and his trial at his parents' house, working with his legal team, occasionally making statements to the press, and, in the view of the prosecution, continuing to attempt to influence potential witnesses. This last point would prove consequential. In July 2023, prosecutors presented evidence to the court that Sam had been communicating with Caroline Ellison through encrypted messaging applications, in what they described as an attempt to tamper with witnesses. The judge presiding over the case, Lewis Kaplan, revoked Sam's bail and remanded him to custody at the Metropolitan Detention Center in Brooklyn. Sam spent the final months before his trial in federal detention. The trial of Sam Bankman-Fried began on October 3, 2023, in a federal courthouse in Lower Manhattan. The courtroom was full. Every day of the trial, reporters and observers filled the public gallery. Outside, a small group of FTX customers sometimes gathered, some holding signs, some simply watching the building, as though proximity to the legal proceedings might bring them closer to the money they had lost. The prosecution's case was, in outline, straightforward. Sam had taken customer money from FTX and transferred it to Alameda Research. Alameda had lost that money through bad trades and excessive spending. Sam had known what was happening. Sam had directed others to conceal it. This was fraud. The defense's case was more complicated, as defenses always must be when the underlying facts are difficult to dispute. Sam, his lawyers argued, had not committed fraud. He had made mistakes. He had misunderstood aspects of his own company's finances. He had acted in good faith, with the genuine intention of building something valuable, and things had gone wrong in ways he had not foreseen. The prosecution called Caroline Ellison as its first major witness. She took the stand and testified for several days. Her manner throughout was striking. Quiet, precise, almost entirely without visible emotion. She had been working with prosecutors for months, and her preparation was evident in the clarity and detail of her testimony. She described, in measured and methodical terms, how the intermingling of FTX and Alameda funds had worked. She described the special code that gave Alameda unlimited withdrawal access to FTX's customer accounts. She described conversations with Sam in which he had directed her to transfer specific amounts of customer funds to Alameda. She described the various versions of Alameda's balance sheet that she had prepared for outside consumption, each one designed, she testified, to conceal the true extent of what had been taken. She had, she said, prepared 7 different versions of Alameda's balance sheet for different audiences. Sam had told her which version to use in which context. The version shown to outside investors did not show that Alameda had borrowed billions of dollars from FTX's customers. She was asked about her relationship with Sam, about whether she had raised concerns with him, about whether she had objected to what was happening. She testified that she had, at times, expressed discomfort, that she had worried about whether what they were doing was legal, that she had raised these concerns with Sam. And Sam, she testified, had reassured her that it was fine, that the arrangement was legal, that Alameda had always effectively had access to FTX's funds as a matter of how the two companies were structured, She had believed him, or had told herself she believed him. She was not, she acknowledged in her testimony, certain that those two things were the same. Gary Wang testified. He described writing the code, the line of software that gave Alameda special access to FTX's accounts, at Sam's direction. He described it as something he had done because Sam asked him to, and because he trusted Sam. Nishad Singh testified. He described his growing awareness of what was happening, the conversation in which he had confronted Sam about it, and Sam's reassurances that everything was under control. He described the moment when he understood that the reassurances were false, that the problem was not a confusion of accounting, but a deliberate arrangement, and that the arrangement had gone catastrophically wrong. He described the emotions of that realization, the grief in it, the sense of having believed in something that did not exist. Ryan Salame had already pleaded guilty to separate charges related to campaign finance violations, but his cooperation provided additional context for the prosecution's picture of the FTX operation. One by one, the people who had been closest to Sam, who had worked with him and believed in him and helped him build the empire, described what they had seen. It was a portrait of a small group of young, idealistic, highly intelligent people who had rationalized their way into a massive fraud, step by step, in small increments, each step seeming manageable until they looked back and saw how far they had come. Sam took the stand in his own defense. He was, as he had always been in public, articulate. He was precise. He engaged with the questions put to him with the focused, analytical manner that had made him seem so credible for so long. He explained complex financial concepts. He described his understanding of how Alameda and FTX were structured. He admitted to mistakes while denying intent to defraud. He was on the stand for several days. He was cross-examined at considerable length by the prosecution. He maintained under pressure the core of his defense, that he had not known, not really known, not in the deliberate way the prosecution was claiming. The jury deliberated for 4 hours. 4 hours to consider the evidence from a month-long trial, the testimony of a dozen witnesses, thousands of pages of documents, and the testimony of the defendant himself. 4 hours. They returned a verdict on all 7 counts. Guilty. In March 2024, Sam Bankman-Fried appeared before Judge Lewis Kaplan for sentencing. He was 31 years old. The government had asked for a sentence of 40 to 50 years. Sam's lawyers had argued for a significantly shorter term, pointing to his cooperation on certain matters, his personal history, and his lack of a prior criminal record. Judge Kaplan sentenced him to 25 years in federal prison. Caroline Ellison was sentenced to 2 years with significant credit for her cooperation with the government. She has a chance to rebuild. Gary Wang received 3 years of probation and no prison time, also in recognition of his cooperation. Nishad Singh received 3 years of probation. The degrees of culpability, as the court saw them, were reflected in the sentences. Those who had cooperated fully and honestly, who had helped the government understand what had happened, who had expressed genuine remorse, received lesser consequences. Sam, who had maintained his innocence throughout, and whose testimony the jury had rejected entirely, received the full weight. The bankruptcy proceedings that followed the collapse of FTX were among the most complex in American legal history. John Ray and his team spent years tracing what had happened to the customer funds. They recovered substantial amounts, frozen accounts, clawed-back transfers, assets that had been transferred but could still be reached through legal process. By mid-2024, the bankruptcy estate had assembled enough resources to propose returning 100 cents on the dollar to FTX's creditors, valued at the prices that prevailed at the time of the bankruptcy. This was, under the circumstances, a remarkable outcome. Not many financial disasters of this scale end with customers made whole. The recovery was a testament to the diligence of the bankruptcy team and, ironically, to the fact that cryptocurrency prices had recovered significantly from their 2022 lows. But the settlement came with a complicated edge. Customers who had held Bitcoin on FTX were receiving the dollar value of Bitcoin in November 2022, not the Bitcoin itself. By the time the settlement was finalized, Bitcoin was trading at several times the price it had been when FTX collapsed. Those customers had been given back their dollars, but they had missed the recovery. The political fallout from FTX's collapse was substantial and lingering. Sam had been one of the most prominent political donors in the cryptocurrency industry, and his donations had reached into both parties, though they were larger on the Democratic side. Politicians who had accepted his money and posed for photographs with him found themselves in uncomfortable positions. Some returned the donations. Some faced questions about what they had known and when. The regulatory debate around cryptocurrency, which Sam had positioned himself as a constructive voice in, shifted significantly after FTX. The collapse became Exhibit A in the argument for stricter oversight of cryptocurrency exchanges. Regulators who had been cautious about moving too quickly found new urgency. Proposals for exchange registration requirements, for mandatory segregation of customer funds, for oversight of stablecoins and exchange tokens moved forward with renewed momentum. Changpeng Zhao, whose 11-word tweet had lit the fuse, did not escape the legal reckoning either. In November 2023, Binance reached a settlement with the United States Department of Justice, pleading guilty to violations of anti-money laundering laws and paying a fine of $4.3 billion. CZ personally pleaded guilty to related charges and was sentenced to 4 months in federal prison. The cryptocurrency industry, in the years following FTX's collapse, undertook a period of intensive self-examination. The most obvious bad actors had been removed. The most glaring structural vulnerabilities, the absence of mandatory customer fund segregation, the lack of regulatory oversight, were being addressed slowly in multiple jurisdictions. Whether the underlying culture had changed was a question that remained, and perhaps will always remain, open. There is a phrase in the effective altruism community. It is galaxy-brained thinking. It refers to a process of reasoning in which a person convinces themselves, through a sequence of individually plausible steps, of a conclusion that would strike most people as obviously wrong. You start from a reasonable premise. You follow the logic. Each step seems to follow from the last, and you end up somewhere very far from where you began, somewhere that requires you to do things that a simpler, less sophisticated person would refuse to do. Galaxy-brained thinking, in the EA community's own analysis of its own failures, is one of the dangers of the framework. The very thing that makes EA powerful, its insistence on rigorous mathematical reasoning, its demand that you follow the argument wherever it leads, can also make it dangerous in the hands of someone who is very good at constructing arguments in service of their own interests. Sam Bankman-Fried was very good at constructing arguments. He had built a philosophy around the idea that the math justified everything, that large expected value calculations could license small ethical violations, that if the destination was good enough, the means were negotiable. He had convinced himself, or appeared to have convinced himself, that he was operating within this framework, that the money was not stolen but borrowed, that the borrowing was not fraud but a temporary imbalance, that the imbalance would be corrected, that the customers would ultimately be fine, that the good he was doing with their money in the long run outweighed the risk he was imposing on them without their knowledge or consent. Perhaps he believed this. Perhaps he never believed it at all. The jury that deliberated for 4 hours had their own opinion. Over 1 million people lost money when FTX collapsed. Some of them lost small amounts. the speculative positions of people who could absorb the loss. Others lost everything they had put into the platform. Others had put in savings they could not afford to lose, drawn in by the advertisements and the celebrity endorsements and the image of a company that seemed more responsible than the rest. For those people, the collapse was not a philosophical exercise. It was rent they could not pay. It was college funds that were gone. It was retirements that had to be rebuilt from the beginning. The long future that Sam had talked about so eloquently, the billions of people who might someday be saved by the resources he was accumulating, that future felt very distant when you were looking at a zero balance on a screen. And yet, there is something worth sitting with on a quiet night like this one. Sam Bankman-Fried was not, in the simple sense, a man without values. He had genuinely given away hundreds of millions of dollars. He had genuinely believed, at some level, in the philosophical framework he had constructed. The people who surrounded him had genuinely believed in something, in each other, in the mission, in the idea that what they were building would matter. They had been wrong about almost everything. The philosophy had been corrupted, weaponized against the people it was supposed to protect. The mission had become a cover story. The good intentions had curdled somewhere into something far more dangerous. But the tragedy is not simply that there were bad people doing bad things. The tragedy is that there were people who wanted to do good and found, somewhere along the way, that they had done the opposite. That is worth thinking about. Not as an excuse. There is no excuse. The fraud was real, the crime was real, the harm was real. But as a kind of warning. The certainty that you are doing good is not the same as actually doing good. The math that justifies everything must always be examined by someone who is not the one constructing it. The philosophy that licenses exception after exception must at some point be questioned by the person using it. Because otherwise, you end up somehow in a federal courtroom being found guilty on all counts, looking back at a path that made sense at every single step and brought you somewhere unrecognizable. Let your breath slow down. Let the story settle. Outside, the world is quiet. Whatever happened today, whatever you are carrying into this night, let it soften a little. Let the edges blur. Some questions don't resolve cleanly. Some stories don't have simple lessons. But the questions themselves about trust, about certainty, about the gap between intentions and actions, those are worth carrying lightly into sleep. You don't have to answer them tonight. Sam Bankman-Fried is in his mid-30s now, in a federal correctional facility. He will be in his mid-50s before he is released if he serves his full sentence. Whatever philosophy shaped him, whatever he actually believed about himself and the world, it sits somewhere in a concrete building in California with a great deal of time to think. Tonight, let it rest. Good night. Word count 14,100. Estimated duration 108 minutes at 130 WPM.